Where are you from is a question that most, if not all of us, have asked or been asked at some point in our lives. It aims to trace the origins of the people that we meet, where they were born or grew up. But honestly, I think it's a pretty overused question, and a more unique, interesting, and original one would be, who are you from? Now that is a question that I will frankly not be answering today, because the truth is that we did not come from the Neanderthals. But that doesn't mean that they aren't related to us, or that they aren't a crucial aspect to understanding our evolutionary history as humans. In fact, they are our closest extinct relatives. Now, the name Neanderthal comes from the place where the first specimen was discovered in 1856, the Neander Valley in Germany. And this was just the first of many Neanderthal discoveries that gave us insight into Neanderthals, or Homo Neanderthalensis, popped into existence around 300,000 years ago, occupying parts of Europe and Western Asia. Now, you may or may not know that the typical idea of a caveman comes from the Neanderthal, but that stereotype is actually pretty far from what they were actually like. That misconception stems from the discovery of a near-complete skeleton found in a cave in France. This wasn't just your average set of Neanderthal bones, though, because these ones belonged to an elderly man with osteoarthritis, so much so that his skeleton was significantly warped. Looking at this skeleton alone, Neanderthals were assumed to be pretty ape-like, dumb, primitive, walking around like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And since that borderline offensive misinterpretation in 1908, numerous discoveries have been made to debunk that myth, to give us more insight into what the Neanderthals actually were like. First of all, they had massive brains. This study in the Scientific Reports Journal used 3D modeling of Neanderthal cranial fossils to reconstruct their brain's shape and size. And the reconstructions of this study ranged in volume from around 1,100 to 1,300 cubic centimeters, which isn't even as big as Neanderthal brains got, because on average, they were around 1,500 cubic centimeters in volume, or even more than that, which is enormous compared to the Homo sapiens average of between 1,300 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. But let's get into the Neanderthal headspace a little bit.
So here we have 4 human skull specimens. First 3, as you may be able to guess, come from Neanderthals, and while they are lacking a few features, we can still use them to evaluate the differences between them and a Homo sapiens skull, which is pictured on the right. Now, the first 2 Neanderthal skulls in this line come from southern France, and the third comes from Italy. And with all of these skulls, we can point out differences and similarities with the modern human to see what the Neanderthals really looked like. And so the first thing we're going to look at is the nasal cavities. And we can see with these 2 Neanderthal specimens here, their nasal cavities were far larger than the Homo sapiens skull, as we can see here. And what this tells us is that the Neanderthals needed huge nasal cavities because they were adapted to colder environments. They needed to warm and moisten the air before it got to their lungs, and having a large nasal cavity allows more room and more time for that air to be warmed and moistened. And we see that in modern humans, we really don't need that adaptation anymore, and so we see a reduced nasal cavity. And now we're going to look at side-by-sides with one Neanderthal skull and the Homo sapiens skull. One major difference we can note here is that the Neanderthal skull has a flatter and more elongated cranial cavity. And this is a difference to note because they had much larger brains than we did, but we can see with the Homo sapiens skull that is taller, rounder, more spherical than the Neanderthal skull. And this protrusion to the rear in the Neanderthal cranial cavity is known as an occipital bun, and it allowed them to accommodate a larger brain and a different shape brain than we see in modern humans. And as we can see with the other 2 Neanderthal specimens, that cranial cavity shape holds up. The last thing I want to draw attention to is the differences in palate. So as we can see in this Neanderthal specimen, they had much larger teeth, especially molars, than we do as Homo sapiens. And the primary reason for this is that today, modern humans don't really need a more powerful bite. We thoroughly cook our food and we have more plants in our diet. There's just not much need today for a super powerful bite. But with the Neanderthals, they definitely had more of an emphasis on meat in their diet, and they needed more powerful bite force that was facilitated by those much larger teeth. And so we see, as time goes on, a reduced dentition size in modern humans. Overall, these skulls let us analyze the differences and similarities between the Neanderthals' anatomy and our own, and it allows us pretty good insight into what they might have looked like and how they weren't too different from us.
But now that we've established that the Neanderthals were not built like Quasimodo, I think it's time that we start asking. Let's start by looking into the Neanderthals' mouths. What did they eat? Though we know that Neanderthals were strikingly similar to modern humans, chances are that they were not chomping down on Big Macs for sustenance. Instead, researchers from the PNAS Scientific Journal analyzed heavy mineralization on Neanderthal teeth. This is called dental calculus. And they used this to examine the remains of what the Neanderthals might have eaten. In these remains, they found traces of a variety of plant foods like grass seeds, tubers, and legumes. This shows that Neanderthals, like modern humans, were omnivores, surviving off of a mix of meat and plants. And this is reflective of their primarily hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The methods of acquiring these foods also mirrored those practices of anatomically modern humans. This study analyzed stone tools from the Mousterian tool industry most associated with the Neanderthals, and cut marks on the bones of small and big game to assert that Neanderthals practiced more modern subsistence strategies, taking advantage of a diverse array of resources both in the land and on water, using stone tools to butcher and skin game, and tracking seasonal patterns in game movement. These practices exhibit the impressive cognitive ability of Neanderthals and directly counters the belief that they were unintelligent and not smart as modern humans. But one thing's for sure, they're definitely smarter than some people in my calc class. But was the brain Neanderthals' biggest asset? Bioarchaeological evidence from this article shows the remains of a disabled Neanderthal specimen found in Shenadar Cave, Israel. This specimen showed signs of joint disease, abnormal bone structure, and several fractures throughout the skeleton that would have impaired movement and cognitive function and possibly could have even led to blindness. But the thing is, the fractures on this skeleton had healed, and this guy lived much longer than would be expected if he'd just been abandoned and left to his injuries, showing that the people around him took the time and resources to support him and help him heal from his injuries. The community ensured his survival, and this is a revelation because it showed that the people around him didn't just say sayonara and leave him for dead the second they realized that he couldn't contribute the same efforts and resources to the well-being of the group. It indicates the extremely complex social structures that Neanderthals had formed and their immense capacity for empathizing and caring for their fellow man. And what's more human than that? But now that we've gotten to know the Neanderthals and their shocking similarities to us in both anatomy and in lifestyle, really the only question left to answer is, where? Neanderthals went extinct around 30 to 40,000 years ago, and you might think that this is long before anatomically modern humans entered the scene. But you would be wrong, because Neanderthals and modern humans actually coexisted in the same regions for up to 10,000 years. Yes, you heard me right. Anatomically modern humans reached Europe around 40,000 years ago, and in fact there was a fair amount of inbreeding between them and the Neanderthals, which is you can see evidence of in some human populations, as some populations carry around 1 to 4% of the Neanderthal genome in their DNA. Wow! And this inbreeding is enough to convince some researchers that we might not even be separate species from the Neanderthals. See, when two groups of a population become so genetically different that they can no longer produce fertile offspring together, they're considered different species. And yet, this is exactly what happened with anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals. We produce fertile offspring, and yet we are considered different species? Make it make sense. Anyways, that remains a topic of debate, as does the reason for the disappearance of Neanderthals after anatomically modern humans entered the stage. Explanations for the extinction have been offered, including an inability to adapt to climate change, or competition with modern humans, or an assimilation into the same species. This investigation used archaeological data and climatic simulations to rule out that first theory, that it was due to an inability to adapt to climate change, and it indicated that climate change was unlikely to have had a significant enough impact on the Neanderthals to completely decimate their population. The article instead supports the second theory, that Neanderthals' anatomies and lifestyles required them to consume a ton of energy through food, and when modern humans arrived, they said, "This town ain't big enough for the both of us," and they shot the Neanderthals out of existence because they were so much better at outcompeting for resources. Though they may no longer be around, it's pretty freaking cool that the Neanderthals, basically our cousins, were so human and so capable, and they deserve to be given their time of day. Ook and Gluck is a graphic novel by the author of Captain Underpants, no less, so you know it's some pretty quality literature. Is about time-traveling cavemen who learned Kung Fu. And while Neanderthals may not have been quite this exhilarating in reality, I wholeheartedly believe that Homo Neanderthalensis, or Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis, if you're on that side of the debate, is one of the coolest topics in all of anthropology. And I hope that now that you're not a Neanderthal noob, you'd be inclined to agree, or at the very least, I hope that you will stop pronouncing it Neanderthal, as I know with a 100% certainty that you have been for your entire life. I will leave you with this very insightful and thought-provoking comic I've created, which I think sums up what I've talked about today pretty well. Now, just like the Neanderthals, it is time that I go extinct. Until next time.